Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third event in the English Association's series, Loneliness and Technology on Motherhood's Lonely States. My name is Jess Cotton. I'm lecturer in English at Cardiff University. For those of you who haven't listened to me give these introductions before. The series is designed to open up questions around loneliness and technology, precisely because of the year we've all been having, a year that has been particularly intense for those who have had to undertake the labour of care and of mothering in particular, especially whilst performing other kinds of labour when there's been little or no public care resources until recently. So mothering, as we'll be exploring today, can be an intensely lonely state, and its loneliness is indicative of the burdens and the fantasies that are placed on the maternal ideal, of the failure of the state to think about what mothers need to assist them, and about women's ambivalent relation to motherhood itself, and ambivalence that doesn't always have space to articulate itself. What interests me in particular in drawing together this question of motherhood and loneliness is that loneliness in this way can become a kind of emotional graph for registering a state that proves insufficient. Mothers are often lonely not because they don't have others around them, though that is sometimes the case, but more commonly because motherhood, even when, or especially when it is a state of constant interruption, to borrow Lisa Baraitser's term, can catapult those who undertake the work of mothering into a state of internal disarray. Mothers have emerged in feminist and psychoanalytic post-war thinking as one of the prime subjects of loneliness, and feminism and psychoanalysis have provided a language for this loneliness. But mothers' responses to loneliness have often been more provisional and spontaneous, devising a technology of their own. In 1935, a woman from Ballingate in Ireland wrote a letter to the magazine Nursery World that opened, "Can any mother help me? I live a very lonely life as I have no near neighbours. I cannot afford to buy a wireless. I adore reading, but with no library I'm very limited with books. I dislike needlework, though I have a lot to do. I get so down and depressed as the children are in bed and I am alone in the house. I sew, read and write stories galore. But in spite of good resolutions and engaging company of cat and dog, I do brood and dig the dead. Can any reader suggest an occupation that will intrigue me and exclude thinking and cost nothing? A hard problem, I admit." Other readers across the UK and Ireland did indeed respond, expressing how they too were suffering from loneliness. These women, who call themselves the Cooperative Correspondence Club, created a private magazine in an attempt to make their loneliness more bearable. They wrote articles about the things that mattered the most to them: children, work, love, and politics, and most importantly, they corresponded. Over the next 50 years, as mothers increasingly entered the workforce, their loneliness was in part abated and in part intensified, as we'll find out in more detail today. New psychoanalytically inflected care strategies, technologies, and television programs such as Watch with Mother emerge as a way to give busy mothers kind of some time alone, and loneliness here cuts both ways. Feminists in the 1970s and 1980s, such as the Hastings Study Group, devised methodologies to conceptualize and give voice to the paradoxes of maternal loneliness. As they discovered, it is difficult to measure loneliness and to find the loneliest subjects. What is required to fully address this question of motherhood and loneliness today? Does technology aid or abate feelings of isolation? And how might we design care, material, and digital technologies with these questions in mind? To answer these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by three speakers who have brilliant and connective responses to these questions. Firstly, Professor Lisa Baraitser will be speaking about the burden of care on mothers during the pandemic and psychoanalysis' response to the state of being alone. She will also speak on mothering as a lifelong state and the kinds of internal objects that children are for mothers. Professor Baraitser is Professor of Psychosocial Theory at Birkbeck, University of London. She works on time, care, and gender, and is the author of the award-winning monograph, Maternal Encounters, The Ethics of Interruption and Enduring Time. She is currently co-principal investigator on an interdisciplinary research project on the relation between time and healthcare, called Waiting Times, funded by the Wellcome Trust. She's the co-editor of the open access journal Studies in the Maternal and co-founder of the research network MAMSI, Mapping Maternal Subjectivities, Identities and Ethics. She is a psychoanalyst in practice in London and member of the British Psychoanalytic Society. Dr. Helen McCarthy will next be talking about what motherhood does to solitude from a historical perspective and how that relates to a wider set of political and social debates in Britain from the 1930s to the 1970s about the problem of housebound motherhood. Dr. McCarthy is reader in modern and contemporary British history at the University of Cambridge. She's the author of 3 books, most recently Double Lives, A History of Working Motherhood. Finally, Dr. Harriet Barrett will focus on 2 examples of technology which intervene in and mediate the mother-infant relationship, an oral history account from a young mother in the 1960s who underwent double arm amputation and became a user of prosthesis, and secondly, Paulina Yeoman's critical design objects, focusing on mothering and smartphones. She'll be focusing on how these objects might reflect various stages and tensions in object relating for both mother and child. And I'm delighted to say I believe that Paulina is in the audience this evening. Dr. Barrett is Senior Research Associate at York St John University, running a co-produced project evaluating the impact of Converge, a programme which offers people with mental health issues free access to university education. Her research interests span the critical medical humanities, literature, psychoanalysis, material culture, public health, and social policy, and interdisciplinary methodologies, particularly around narratives of material and sensory experience. She is part of the Wellcome-funded collective Senses of Modern Healthcare Environments, a regular oral history volunteer, particularly with NHS's Voices of COVID project, and a member of the Brighton and Sussex University Hospital NHS Trust Onward Arts Group. So that just leaves for me a brief moment of housekeeping, and the talks will be followed by a discussion between the panelists, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So please do post questions as you go in the chat, and then we'll get round to it at the end. And you're welcome at the end to kind of unmute yourself and ask questions directly, but please do stay muted while the speakers are talking. I will hand over to Lisa, who will speak first, and I'm going to try and navigate Lisa's technology for her, so do bear with us if we have some technological difficulties to start with.
Jess. Well, Jess is loading up, so I just have a few images and a couple of quotes that just might help us as we go along. But first of all, to say thanks. So let me just see if I can make sure I can see my own. Yeah, great. So big thanks to Jess for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to speak, and for including motherhood's lonely states as one of the topics of this wonderful series of talks, and to the English Association for hosting this Loneliness and Technology series. I'm not going to say very much about technology other than the technologies of psychic space. What I want to offer is some thoughts about what the maternal does to our understanding of this question of being alone. To think about what kind of internal object a child might be for a mother, and whether the state of maternal subjectivity can ever be one of aloneness. So I'm going to go over some ground that might be familiar for many of you who are psychoanalytically inclined. I'll talk a bit about Winnicott and a little bit about Bracha Ettinger's work to help us think about the capacity to be alone. I'm also going to turn back to some work I've done before, using Denise Riley's work to think about she gives us a way to understand the temporalities of an ongoing, lively attachment to a dead child. And I want to try and say something about new configurations of the home and the difficulty of adult children not moving out of the current arrangements organised through the asset economy, and what to do with the question of not being able to be alone. So the prompt, of course, for these thoughts is the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the confirmation of what many of us were pretty certain would play out, which is that mothers have and will bear the brunt of the global pandemic. Whilst it appears that the world has woken up to the fact that we are interdependent and all need care throughout our lives, and that we live in what the Care Collective call a careless world, led by neoliberal markets that have enacted systemic violence on our capacity to give and receive care, the impact of such violence is paradoxically felt disproportionately by mothers. those who are at least socially and politically positioned to care. And these are statistics that I'm sure you'll be familiar with already. The survey of 20,000 mothers that was undertaken by Pregnant Then Screwed found that in the UK, 46% of women were made redundant during the pandemic because of lack of childcare. 72% have had to work fewer hours because of childcare problems, and calls to legal helplines for working mothers rose by 450%. The results of these inequalities filter directly to children, with 2.5 million children now living in food insecure households in the UK and 1 in 3 in poverty. 60% of women using domestic violence services are mothers. And there was a surge, as we know, in domestic violence worldwide during lockdowns. And the UN reported dramatic increases in calls to shelters and refuges in every part of the globe. Although, of course, motherhood is not the only form of social care, parental leave systems and other cultural and social structures nevertheless set women up as primary carers, placing the burden of care for both children and the failures of the care system itself on mothers. So whilst COVID has pushed our interconnected interdependencies into light in an unprecedented way, this insight was always impossible to ignore if the maternal is used as a way to disrupt and decenter the fantasy of autonomy and individuality. It is perhaps one of the reasons that the maternal remains such a simultaneously idealized and repudiated figure in public life. No one wants to be reminded that autonomy and individuality are fantasies. Do you want to just do the next slide? It's just a quote from Judith Butler. Judith Butler states in her recent work on the force of nonviolence, no one is born an individual. If someone becomes an individual over time, he or she does not escape the fundamental conditions of dependency in the course of that process. That condition cannot be escaped by way of time. We were all, regardless of our political viewpoints in the present, born into a condition of radical dependency. This is a condition we do not outgrow. As we were reminded so keenly during the pandemic, we were literally propped up by others, given over to a web of institutions and social and material structures in order to survive. Just as disability studies has shown how a social structure must provide dependable support in order to enable everybody to live a full life, so maternal studies, we could argue, has shown what Butler calls radical dependency cannot be completely cut free from the material histories of social reproduction, the ethics and politics of care, and this effectively charged figure of the mother, this idealized and repudiated figure. So just the next slide, thanks. So as Maria Puig de la Pelacasa tells us in Matters of Care, in her work on maintenance of life systems such as soil, so she's interested in permaculture, for example, care plays out along 3 axes: labour, work; ethics, politics; affect, affectations. And these domains do not sit comfortably together. They must be held in tension if we are to keep close to the ambivalent terrains of care. Dependency is structural to the human subject, and it calls for social structures that care. But we forget the particular ambivalent tie between care and the maternal, I think, at our peril, for both the social structure and for those who identify as mothers themselves. So if we do not outgrow the conditions of radical dependency, what does this mean for being alone? And what does it mean for mothers? Does aloneness have something to do with independence or interdependence? Does maternality, understood as a condition of severality, of being always already more than one, disrupt notions of aloneness, as premised on the bounded subject, the upright subject, the subject that Adriana Cavarera dislodges with her figure of the inclined subject, the mother reaching towards the child? And if we read backwards from the position of the mother, rather than forwards from the perspective of the child, what are the radical dependency needs of mothers? On whom and on what social and psychic structures does she depend? Whom or what props her up? And I'm largely going to deal with those psychic structures now rather than the social ones, which I guess sociologists are better able and possibly historians to do than I am. So just the next slide, thanks. So Winnicott's famous phrase, this will be familiar to many of you, which he restates in a footnote in the theory of parent-infant relationship, states, "I once said there is no such thing as an infant, meaning, of course, that wherever one finds an infant, one finds maternal care, and without maternal care, there would be no infant." Maternal care, in other words, produces infants. The question is, what produces maternal care? Would it be a helpful move to state there is no such thing as a mother? There is only ever a maternal subject precipitated by a relation, real or imagined, with an other whom one may come to name and claim as one's child, regardless of blood ties, generational bonds, gender, or even the aliveness of the child. Winnicott tells us the capacity to be alone is an achievement of maturation, something that happens over time and in conditions in which two-ness establishes oneness. As we know, Winnicott tends to count 2, 1, 3, rather than 1, 2, 3. In the beginning, that is, there is no ego, only an unintegrated experience, one of falling forever, a state of profound anxiety that threatens the ongoing being of the infant. But this state occurs in the presence of another who can usually, if things go well, do something Winnicott calls holding. And this enables an ego to cohere, out of two-ness, oneness, or what he calls unit status, can emerge. In his 1958 paper, The Capacity to Be Alone, Winnicott makes a distinction between being withdrawn, a defensive psychic organization that anticipates persecution that occurs when holding has not gone so well, with something else, this capacity to be alone. And this eventually does have to do with whether there is someone else there or not. As he states, it does not have to do with that. As he states, a person may be in solitary confinement and yet not be able to be alone. How greatly he must suffer is beyond imagination. Being able to enjoy solitude is, he states, a highly sophisticated phenomenon, based on the paradox of being alone while someone else is present. He critiques Klein for working with the notion that being alone depends on building up an internal good object through repeated experiences of instinctual gratification. This requires a rudimentary ego, something that Winnicott suspects is only established through maternal care. So unpacking the statement, I am alone, I implies unit status, am some form of integration, alone, the reliance on the mother's continued existence. So this capacity relies on a maternal presence that is not destroyed by the infant's hate, its aggression, its raids on the maternal body, its destructiveness. I am alone adds up to ego relatedness. Theoretically, this means there is always someone present, but now internalized. One of the main problems with Winnicottian theory is it actually tells us nothing about mothers, and certainly nothing about their capacity to be alone as a distinctive capacity, that is, alone in relation to their children. It assumes the child takes their capacities into adulthood, and on becoming a mother, the mother draws on her own internalized capacities, forged through her own experience of being mothered, in order to be able to hold the child and help them develop a capacity to be alone. So good enough mothering begets good enough mothering, but mothering itself doesn't seem to prompt anything new in the chain, and the maternal subject collapses, as I've argued elsewhere, under the weight of the child's developing needs. Nothing comes back to the mother from the child in this account. She only passes on. There is, of course, another psychoanalytic stream we can draw on. You want to do the next slide. And this is Bracha Ettinger's work on the matrixial. And again, for many of you, this will be familiar, but for some of you, it won't. So moving away from a Freudian Lacanian notion that we emerge out of a series of separations, retroactively gathered up as having been precipitated by birth and culminating with Oedipus, and also moving away from this Winnicottian frame that we've just discussed that leaves, if you like, the paternal and the maternal binary in the same place that it always is, with the mother as the subject who holds and then somehow appropriately fails and gradually fades away. Ettinger tries to think about difference in a different way, using the late stage of pregnancy as a figuration for a substrata of psychic life that we can never separate from. She suggests that the I and the non-I emerge in coexistence. Here, there are only partial objects, a not yet mother and a not yet infant. This is the Matrixial Borderspace, a space of co-affecting encounters that lay down a primordial capacity for being together without merger and being together without catastrophic separation. So this would be another model for maternal aloneness. This is retained, she argues, as a capacity for transsubjectivity in adult life. So the matrixial is a principle of severality, of at least two-ness, that supplements the phallic processes of separation and is the basis, she says, for ethical encounter, the ability to be with others that does not devour or invade or abandon. And she calls that whole process sexual difference. In that difference itself emerges through the encounter with the feminine. It is specific to gestation within a body identified as feminine. Sexual difference is not about establishing ways we are different from one another, but is difference that is established in a state of what she calls withness, which is also witness. So this means that all birthed subjects carry with them an aspect of sexual difference that refuses or exceeds binary logic. If we were always at least two, if the subject emerges out of co-affective exchange under these conditions of severality, then subjectivity is about being with others in such a way that we cannot know or predict, but underpinned by a shared experience of the continuity or the remains of severality from which we cannot be severed. So each encounter continues to be absolutely new, but what remains from interuterine life is the embodied knowledge of radical difference. So I would suggest then that this helps us a little with thinking about maternal aloneness, rather than viewing the maternal subject as the child, now grown up, who has a capacity to be alone and goes on to hold the child in such a way that doesn't impinge or invade, but can, after this period of primary maternal preoccupation, fail in order to protect the child. Ettinger's model suggests that an experience of severality is not a developmental achievement, but a given, an underlying psychic structure that cannot be gotten rid of, cannot be refused, cannot or need not fail. It is simply the condition of gestation itself. This means the maternal or the matrixial is a principle of not being able to not be alone. So returning to the pandemic, many different things, of course, happened to mothers, but I want to hold on to this maternal principle to think about what happened to mothers. The pandemic did not just throw mothers with small children into endless and at times terrifying proximity, leaving them desperate for time alone, but it also highlighted the experience of mothers who lost their children, and of course their adult children, to COVID, as well as hundreds of thousands of mothers who lost contact with their adult children when locked down in care homes or in conditions of isolation in their own homes during the pandemic. We don't, after all, stop being mothers when our children leave home. Motherhood, I would say, is a lifelong condition, even after the death of our children. Into the next slide, Jess. I'm aware of the time. Denise Riley notes in Live Time Without Its Flow that charts what happened to time after the death of her adult child, that time stopped is an inadequate metaphor for the prolonged, arrested, and oddly lively time that sets in after the death of a child. One engagement with a dead child, she maintains, is vivid, not the dead time of depression or melancholia. In fact, she refuses that figuration altogether. The idea that one holds onto the dead child or refuses to give it up in order not to be abandoned by the child in conditions of acute grief. The internalized dead child is something else entirely. And she writes, "What do the dead give us? A grip on the present instant in which we are now relentlessly inserted. Not in a contemplative sense, but vigorously, a carnal sensation. If to be dead is to exist outside of earthly time, then this tough-minded, energetic living in the present is also the life of the dead. My new ability to live in the present is a joining in of that timelessness of being dead, or the nearest I can get to it." If you just do the next slide. Later in the book, she states, "You are time, you are saturated with it, rather than standing apart from it as a previously contemplated being who was free to move around in it." So here the internal object, the dead child, is time itself. Later still, she says, just the next slide, if there is ever to be any movement again, that moving will not be on, it will be with the carried again child. Later she writes, he is not dead to me. And later still, half bitten away by the child's disappearance, your time is nevertheless augmented, for the time of the dead is, from now on, contained within your own. So here I mean to draw attention to the way that a child constitutes an internal object for a mother, even when dead, through a mother's capacity to allow the dead time of the child to fill her. This, it seems to me, is a way to glimpse the impossibility of maternal aloneness as the condition of maternality. If the maternal is a relation to an other of temporal disjunction, in which the unfolding of one life happens in relation to the unfolding of another, but out of sync, then we cannot rid ourselves of, be separated from, this time of unfolding. So my final bit, I just want to give you one more image, which is about the home. The home, during the pandemic, unexpectedly became reanimated in public life, as if it took a pandemic for discussions about homelessness to resurface, a reckoning with the extent that the home is a place of violence and coercion for some, a place of distinct unhomeliness and unbelonging for others, a space that is now entirely penetrated by work, as for many, as the new spirit of capitalism have been arguing for decades. The home is also a place that children living in what Melinda Cooper and Lisa Adkins call the asset economy cannot leave. So the so-called boomerang generation cannot afford to move out of home, elongating adulthood and giving rise to new conditions of what some call waithood. So I want to end by just returning to an artwork made by Rachel Whiteread in 1993. Some of you may remember, not all of you will, called House, that only existed for 3 months. It was completed in autumn 1993 and demolished in January 1994, just 3 months later. And it was a cast of a Victorian house on Grove Road in the East End of London. That was the last standing house of a terrace that had been demolished around it. And what she did was basically carefully restructure and then coat from the inside the house and cast it in concrete. And then she then took the brickwork away from the outside of the house. So what you saw was a cast of the inside of the house, but itself was hollow. The concrete was only 10 centimeters deep. And so to leave it, she had to go out of the roof. So there's lots to say about this artwork, but I just want to offer it to you as a kind of way of thinking about experiences of home, homeliness, unhomeliness during the pandemic, as family is formed and reformed in this new asset economy. It's an image that I think has some relation to what we're talking about. I think of it as a kind of maternal figure, a testament in part to a history of domestic and care labour that has been assigned to women historically, particularly working class women, and to women of colour, but also a figuration of this incapacity to be alone that I've been trying to describe. So the internal lining, in other words, that is revealed when those bricks are peeled off, is itself a lining of an interior space, but one that is like an inside kind of skin. So I want to leave that as a figuration of an internal object that a child is for a mother, whoever that is, who has allowed the unfolding of someone to occur in relation to one's own unfolding in an asynchronous way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that wonderful paper, Lisa. I feel like I've suddenly, it's made the kind of whole pandemic experience suddenly tangible in a new way as I was listening to it. I look forward to kind of returning to the paper, but I will hand over now to Helen, who will give us some kind of historical perspective on housebound motherhood, indeed linking this idea of the house in the 1930s to the 1970s.
Okay, I've unmuted myself, haven't I? You can all hear me. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's always so stimulating to participate in interdisciplinary conversations and to have one's thinking challenged. However, I am a historian, so I'm going to take you back into the past and to the year 1963. So asked for her views on work and family, a middle-class mother of 4 in her early 40s and living in Glasgow wrote the following. When my children are all at school, I shall probably feel obliged to do some voluntary work, but at the moment I don't look forward to it. I can't imagine missing the company and liveliness of professional life. All I want and don't get in my busy domestic life is some solitude. In fact, I have refused an au pair girl because I want to have the house to myself for an hour or 2 every day. I do a little freelance writing now and may extend it later. So this mother was writing in response to a questionnaire circulated by the sociologist Viola Klein, who had been commissioned by the British Federation of University Women to explore the constraints facing graduate mothers who were trying to get back into the workplace. And this was a very timely topic in the 1960s, when increasing numbers of married women, graduate and non-graduate alike, were returning to the labour market in their late 30s and early 40s, typically when their children had gone to school. The Federation wanted better information about the particular problems experienced by women who had pursued professional careers before marriage and motherhood, hence this survey. Most of the replies were from graduate women who were either already back in the workplace or indicated a strong wish to do so. This reply belongs to the minority of mothers who expressed ambivalence about returning to the workplace. And what interests me is the manner in which the respondent describes her feelings. As you can see, she doesn't complain of loneliness or isolation as a housebound mother of 4. She can't imagine missing the company and liveliness of professional life. She positively wishes to be alone in a literal sense. She wants to have the house to herself for an hour or 2 every day. And this wish is associated with her desire for creative and artistic activity. I do a little freelance writing now and may extend it later. And for this, she requires solitude, which is all she wants and what she does not get. Now, when I first came across this testimony in the archive about 5 or 6 years ago, I felt an electrifying shock of recognition. So at that time, my daughters were about 3 and 5. I was working full time. I felt very much in the thick of it. And solitude, or what I probably would have called time to myself or time for myself, was really all I wanted too. And as the work of Barbara Taylor and Faye Bound-Alberti shows us, solitude as a concept has a rich intellectual and cultural history stretching back to the era of Enlightenment thought. As Rousseau asked in his famous Reveries of the Solitary Walker, detached from the whole world, what am I? So rather like Lisa, I want to ask this question of what motherhood does to solitude in the period since the Second World War, but coming at it from a rather different perspective. My focus is going to be on Britain, although a lot of what I'm going to say may very well apply to North America and to other Western capitalist societies. And I want to explore how motherhood became closely associated with the state of being alone in these decades, and how that state was framed as a problem for both individuals and wider society. Okay, so the housebound mother became an object of political and social policy discourse really in the 1930s and 1940s. There emerged between the wars a new demand, articulated most consistently by women in the Labour Party, the Women's Cooperative Guild, and other housewives associations, for leisure. If the mother was a worker in the home, which these organisations insisted that she was, then she should have time off, just like men had time to relax when they left their factories or the pit. What mothers might do with this leisure varied between associational activities and solitary ones. The hard-pressed housewife might spend a free evening or afternoon attending a lecture or a study group, or she might read a book, listen to the wireless, or go to the cinema. The point was that women, who were now equal citizens with votes, were entitled to time away from housework and childcare, and indeed needed such time to develop as full human beings. We find a less overtly politicized version of this demand in some of the middlebrow fiction of the period, which Alison Light has written about. She points to novels such as E.M. Delafield's Diary of a Provincial Lady and Jan Struther's Mrs. Miniver to suggest how, for middle-class wives and mothers, domesticity became increasingly associated with self-cultivation, interiority, and creative leisure between the wars. Now, if we jump forward to the late 1940s, we find just a glimmer of official recognition of these demands in the report of the Royal Commission on Population, which was appointed to explore the causes of Britain's falling birth rate. Having heard evidence from some of these women's organisations, the Commission concluded it is clear that in general, women today are not prepared to accept, as most women in Victorian times accepted, a married life of continuous preoccupation with housework and care of children, and that the more independent status and wider interests of women today, which are part of the ideals of the community as a whole, are not compatible with repeated and excessive childbirth. And it recommended a range of family services, as they were called, to enable the housebound mother to play a fuller part in society, including home helps, nursery schools, play centres, rest homes, and babysitting schemes. None of these, however, materialised in any significant way after the Second World War. There was a bit of an expansion in nursery schools, but not on a large scale. And it's striking how almost 20 years later, Hannah Gavron was calling for the same kinds of measures to be implemented in her sociological study of young mothers, The Captive Wife. And Gavron sets out her proposals for what she calls the reintegration of the mother with young children into society, suggesting the establishment of parent-teacher associations along the lines which already existed in the USA, an expansion of play facilities, and by making public spaces of all kinds, from buses and department stores to museums and hospitals, more accessible and welcoming to women with small children. Now, by the time Gavron was writing, the idea that motherhood put women at risk of social isolation and, by extension, psychological distress was well established. This concern was frequently linked to higher rates of geographical mobility and the dispersion of families, severing the old ties of intergenerational reciprocity and neighbourliness. The problem of social isolation also became central to discourses of married women's employment, which, as I noted earlier, was on the rise. So by 1971, nearly half of all married women were in employment, compared to just over 20% 2 decades earlier. And paid work was increasingly presented as a remedy for loneliness and the nervous strain of being housebound. There's evidence from the post-war decades of doctors actively encouraging mothers to take on part-time jobs to settle their nerves. The social researcher Pearl Jeffcott interviewed working-class housewives in South London in the late 1950s who told her, "I felt so heavy, I got morbid, and I worried over little things, problems which then seemed to vanish when these women had part-time factory shifts to look forward to." There is a tension, however, in these post-war discourses of the dangers of immersive domesticity for women, and this kind of connects directly to some of the things that Lisa was just talking about. It's not always clear in these debates whether the problem was the presence of children or alternatively their absence. So some voices in these debates seem to suggest that the mother who spent her day cooking meals, changing nappies, playing games, and helping with homework was rarely lonely or depressed. Instead, it was the mother with older children at school all day or fully grown who was climbing the walls with boredom and who needed help. When doctors first identified the phenomenon of suburban neurosis in the late 1930s, it was associated with young childless wives or with mothers who only had one child. And a typical suggestion made by those doctors at the time was for women to have more babies. There was an alternative perspective, however, which we find in Gavron's work and in much of the feminist literature thereafter, which identified the presence of children as the chief source of a housewife's loneliness or isolation. Their constant care demands made her less mobile, deprived her of adult company, and cut her off from the social world. Hence Gavron's call for reintegration. And this idea, as we all know, of the mother-child dyad as an intense psychological and physical bond was closely related to the psychoanalytic thought of the time, the theories of John Bowlby, Donald Winnicott, and others, which were popularized and consumed widely by mothers in the 1950s and 60s, and then became a major target of feminist critique in the 1970s. So it's concepts such as maternal deprivation, which taught housebound mothers that their feelings of discontent and distress were not legitimate and might indeed even be harmful to their children. So far, I've talked mostly about policy and political debates and sociocultural discourses, but we need, of course, to set this kind of talk about motherhood's lonely states alongside what mothers were actually doing. And as we've seen, not only were large numbers of mothers with school-aged children returning to the workplace, but those at home with under fives were finding ways to overcome the risk of isolation. So as the work of Angela Davis, Lynn Abrams, Kate Beaumont and others have shown, this was the era in which the Married Women's Register, the Preschool Playgroups Association and the National Childbirth Trust came into being, creating new spaces for mothers to meet alongside existing voluntary associations and church groups. And the sort of the hegemony of the inward-looking privatized nuclear family of this era should not be overplayed. There's plenty of evidence that women still visited kin regularly, made friends at the school gate or in the GP surgery, met up for play dates and held coffee mornings. This is also the era in which telephones are increasingly a tool, a technology of sociability and connection for family, for women and their family and friends. And indeed, when I was on maternity leave a decade ago in East London, I was very conscious of this elaborate infrastructure of maternal sociability that was in place and available to me. And we find its historic roots really in those post-war decades. And if anything, it was the pressure to participate in this elaborate infrastructure of maternal sociability at all times, rather than the fear of loneliness that oppressed me. And this brings us back to our mother of four in Glasgow and to what motherhood does to solitude. So I'm just going to wrap things up here. As my very brief historical survey suggests, the demand for time to oneself was initially framed between the wars in terms of an entitlement to leisure. It became subsequently entangled in discourses of maternal mental health, and then it provided one form of legitimacy for wage earning by mothers outside the home. Using leisure for solitude, as our Glasgow mother wished to do, rather than for sociability, did not feature prominently in these post-war debates, although I think that one can identify a strand of continuity in relation to middle-class women's lives with that interwar middle-brow literature that I mentioned earlier. And I think by the 1950s, this has adopted a posture of nostalgia or loss, a theme that does emerge more widely from the 1963 questionnaire replies is the sense that things have got tougher for middle-class women because they don't have residential domestic help, because nannies and housekeepers are now too expensive or simply unavailable. So in the 1930s, it's servant keeping that makes interiority possible for Mrs. Miniver or the provincial lady. And that might be partly what's going on in that opening quote of mine. Although here, you know, we actually find a housewife who wants her solitude, even if it costs her domestic help in the form of an au pair. So I don't really have a proper conclusion, but just a final thought, which is to say that however we theorize or historicize motherhood's lonely states, we must attend to differences of class. And also of race, which I haven't really talked about, and doesn't appear explicitly in a lot of the debates that I've mentioned, except at moments when women of colour, most of whom are migrants to Britain in this post-war period, are explicitly located outside those debates as other, as representing difference and deviance. So if some middle-class mothers felt the loss of solitude in this period, we should ask whether for working class and migrant mothers, it was ever historically available at all. And I hope you will forgive me, but I'm just going to end with a tiny plug that so I write much more about this in my book, History of Working Mothers. And if you're interested in the 1963 questionnaire, I've got an article out just recently in Past and Present, which tells you a lot more about that questionnaire. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. That was a fascinating kind of paper, and I love how it brought class and labour into this conversation in a way that it kind of is often overlooked in kind of questions of loneliness, and really becomes a way to think about the impact of the post-war state on the present moment, and the kind of the text that's crossing both papers is for me thus far is Denise Riley's War in the Nursery, and thinking about the kind of intensified kind of war in the nursery at the moment. On which note, thinking about kind of possible remedies to loneliness and technologies that might help us kind of navigate them, I will pass over to Harriet.
Lovely, thanks Jess, and thanks to the English Association as well for the invitation to speak. I'm really pleased to be here. So I will just share my screen. Okay. There we go. Is that all right? Can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, lovely. So yes, as Jess said in the introduction to tonight's seminar, my research, although I quite greedily listed a whole list of disciplines, my research primarily looks at the meeting point of psychoanalytic theory and material culture. So both areas of study which are really intimately tied up with the idea of the maternal. So as Freud points out, the two words maternal and material have an etymological link with the material out of which something is made, constituting its mother part. So both disciplines are concerned with the way that origin and origins affect experience. So tonight I'm going to talk about two instances of technology in relation to motherhood and materiality. And with each one, I'm interested in how the technology itself highlights the space between mother and infant, and how it provides texture to a discussion around motherhood and loneliness. And that's in terms of both the sensory experience of that and the psychical experience. I also just want to flag up that there is a very brief mention of attempted suicide early on in the first case study. So my first section looks at the oral history of a woman who has been a user of prosthetic arms since the 60s, and how her initial experience of that prosthetic technology affected her sense of maternal identity. And then in the second section, as Jess flagged up earlier, I'm going to discuss the work of Paulina Yerman. Fantastic you're here tonight, Paulina. And Paulina is a designer and researcher who's done some really fascinating work on how the use of the smartphone plays out in the mother-infant relationship. And I think these two case studies really complement each other, despite their differences in chronology and technology, but in that both are concerned with the potential for ambivalence and loneliness in the heart of the maternal experience. So a couple of years ago, I did some research in the archives of the Roehampton limb fitting clinic, which became a centre for prosthetic technology in the First World War. And the extracts I want to talk about today come from an oral history interview carried out in 2009 with a woman called Abate, who lost both arms in 1965 when she was 26 with a 10-day-old baby at home. And she had been very depressed when she was first pregnant, and her accident was in fact an attempt to take her own life. So I think it's fair to say that ambivalence was already a very strong feature of her experience of pregnancy and mothering. And I just want to acknowledge, first of all, that of course we as a culture have have historically aligned ideas of mental or social wholeness with physical wholeness, so something that further complicates the specifics of this case study and this woman's life history. And I would really encourage people who are interested in this really problematic history to look at the literature from disability studies on this. So AB describes her early treatment as, quote, a maze of nothing in terms of clinical support. And in the early days, her husband had to create a cuff for what she calls her stump, while she was waiting to be referred to the specialist unit at Roehampton to be fitted with prosthetics. AB says, "They wouldn't let me go home to stay at home, and I nearly went crazy because they couldn't see how to fit a fork into this cuff. And I was screaming inside, please get it in, please get it in. I don't want you to feed me." So part of the complexity of this woman's experience, I think, turns upon this forced regression to a childlike state herself, combined with this really problematic identity as a new mother. She describes the simultaneous pain and pleasure of seeing her young child again after her double arm amputation, quote, "because these other women were looking after her and I couldn't." And as a side note, the first arms that she was given while waiting for her own bespoke ones were a pair of men's arms that were too heavy to really be used. And she also describes the artificial hands which came with them as, quote, "just clenched fists." So unsurprisingly, elsewhere in the interview, she talks about how she preferred to take off her prostheses to pick up her baby to retain skin contact. So I think to evoke Christopher Bolus's work, I think you can get the sense that this mother feels her status as her baby's primary transformational object to be at risk. She suggests her capacity to psychically hold and transform her baby's experience is limited by the changes to her physical hold. And elsewhere in the wider oral history collection for this hospital, for the limb fitting clinic, a nurse, also in the 60s, tells another female patient with arm prostheses that, quote, "your baby will adapt to you." And AB did, in fact, with the help of her occupational therapist, later adapt all her baby's clothes to Velcro fastenings in an echoing of the psychical adaptation that was taking place for both of them. But initially, I think you can hear in the quotes on this slide the very lonely and distancing, very spatial, I think, effect of this difficult process. And you can hear that in her choice of language. So she maintained contact with her young daughter at a house where I went to, peopled with other women. So these are not felt to be by AB, felt to be supportive domestic spaces, and she does not in her own body here feel like a supportive maternal environment, believing that she has herself been rendered a strange object and an object of fear for the baby. And it's their hard surfaces and strangeness that AB is suggesting here, I think, that run the risk of them becoming a kind of anti-transitional object. So one which hasn't been selected by the baby, one which stands in for the mother's arms, but without the soft and comforting qualities that we would usually associate with transitional objects. And I think this focus also shows perhaps how AB is less comfortable with discussing how she herself relates to the prostheses. So here, "I don't want to clutch her with these arms, she'll be afraid." And it's also notable, I think, that this woman chose, whose full oral history interview is fascinating, and there's so much more I could say about it. But just to end this part of the talk, I think it's notable that AB chose to take part in a television documentary about 18 months after her accident, called, presumably by the editors, called "Look, Mummy Has No Hands," which you can still access on the Wellcome Collection's online library. And it had the subtitle, "A double arm amputee returns to her work as a wife and a mother." So I think that film offers another way to really dwell in this kind of very unflinching way that AB describes really huge ambivalence about both motherhood and patienthood, with both those reactions being jammed into this really palatable, perhaps even sort of faux jolly public container for those difficult feelings in the form of the film. So I'm going to move on now to the second section of my talk, which is equally concerned with how the technological objects of motherhood embody a form of ambivalence that presents a challenge to persistent narratives of the maternal. And unlike the 1960s context for AB's account, this example focuses on the ubiquitous modern object of the smartphone. So I'm going to talk about two of Paulina Uhrmann's critical design objects. And critical design, for those of you who maybe are less familiar with the term, seeks to ask questions through a kind of speculative approach to design and to provoke the audience to reflect and debate. The objects I'm going to discuss aren't meant to be marketable products. And crucially, as Paulina points out in her wider work, both critical design and psychoanalysis seek to expose what is usually unexposed. So smartphones, of course, are often the site of real judgment around modes of maternal attention, both in itself and as it is performed or signalled in a social setting. And Ehrman describes the phone here as an object of competition for parental attention, but one which also turns the mother into a rival since its use is often shared. And in this, it offers multiple and competing discourses. So tonight I'm going to focus on just two of Ehrman's critical design objects in this context. And both of these objects were discussed with mothers in a series of engagement workshops by Ehrman as part of her research. So first up is ambivalent object number 1. So a sippy cup adapted to hold a smartphone just inches away from a baby's face. And apparently many workshop participants were really uncomfortable when first faced with this object. So it'd be interesting to hear what your initial reactions are as well. I'm sure Paulina would like to as well, to hear them. And there's a sense, I think, that, pardon me, that this object, it invades the somewhat kind of hallowed space between mother and child during feeding in particular. And so a participant called Kate here comments, feeding is a kind of pacification, really, filling the baby's tummy, but also one of those moments when it's really lovely to share that experience. And Tina says, I didn't want my son to have the habit of feeding and having some screen time at the same time. So part of the discomfort provoked by this object is around that sense of intrusion into the mother-infant dyad. But of course, it's a dyad that's never really a dyad in any case, but intimately tied up in the social network around it and the material setting, both of which fuel the psychical processes of the act of maternal care. So just to go back to the image, it's also a discomfort, that hones in particularly on this idea of nourishment. And I think this discomfort turns on this kind of tacit shared acceptance that any act of feeding is both a psychical and a physical process. So the baby is taking something tangible in from the mother's breast, or as here, from an intermediate object provided by the mother, but they are also taking in part of the mother's mind. So as Pierre Aulagnier puts it, the baby builds its internal world by taking objects shaped by the work of the mother's psyche as its raw materials. So the mother is the first source of the baby's internal landscape and the representations which people it. In a way, the mother herself plays a prosthetic role there. And Aulagnier continues, quote, to ask what characterizes the human is to confront from the outset psychical activity with an elsewhere. And that elsewhere is in infanthood, I think, the mother's own psyche. And in Ehrman's objects, it's the smartphone that stands in for this sense of an elsewhere. So with the workshop feedback about these objects in this series, and many of the wider anecdotes as well that Ehrman lists in her research, there's this additional layer to the discomfort that the objects provoke, with the implication being not only that the baby should be fed pure psychical nourishment, but that the mother should herself abstain from the phone's influence as well. This kind of implicit sense that the mother should be a purifying filter of cultural pollutants. And I think this discomfort itself reinforces the fact that feeding is often an intensely ambivalent act, which offers both good and difficult content. I also really like the way that the difficulties of the design itself aren't resolved with this object. So it's very awkward, it's uneven and changeably weighted. And if it were a marketable product, I don't think the phone would last very long. So there's a refusal to kind of neaten or refine the tensions inherent in the questions that are raised by this critical design object. And interestingly, Paulina notes as well that while the objects in this series did disturb most of the mothers she spoke to, they were still curious about how they might be adapted as usable objects. So just going on to the very final object of my talk then, this is another from Ehrman's ambivalent object series, and in fact I think ambivalent objects might even have been a title that Lisa suggested to Paulina. So this is a sort of composite pull-along bottle toy with an incorporated smartphone, as you can see. And the narrative in Yeoman's research that accompanies this object explicitly positions it as a transitional object, so an object that stands in for the mother, for the child. And to me, it's a transitional object that cannot yet be used quite as a thing in its own right. So it's strongly associative power. Obviously, it very much looks like a breast. It's obviously designed to draw forth that association, and that invites a relationship to it, but it doesn't quite allow or encourage the user to develop or mobilize a capacity to use it as a thing in itself with its own unique properties. So the smartphone, as you can see, is sort of integral to the object, but it's obscured by where it's placed. It's literally obscured by the focus on the breast. And I think this inability to be used is also central to critical design. So it's the social or psychological obstacles to use an object that help us to start asking different questions. And that's materialized in the physical obstacle of the difficult object presented. And to me, this object also presents or suggests the possibility presented by a smartphone for wider networking with third objects, so people outside the dyad, in a space lying just beyond that early phase of breastfeeding. And this is a possibility that mothers are conditioned to feel, in the workshop quotes, conditioned to feel they should reject. But as Alice here says in the top quote, I feel that children, babies, should not have that much technology around them. But then I think, oh, actually, often they do. We do sit with the phone all of the time. But for now, the ambivalent object of this this sort of bottle breast toy, pull-along toy, is a not totally functional and a not fully used object, but it can perhaps be taken as a symbol of the good enough object and the good enough mother, with the breast, the toy, and the smartphone cohabiting in one space. And I think in this context, it's important that it's quite a frustrating object that would test the child's growing dependent independence. And both Alice and Brenda also in the workshops point to the way this object suggests a mother abnegating her role as primary carer, with this pull-along toy seeming to suggest, quote, bring yourself up, here's the phone, here's the milk, here's your toy. Or in the second one, giving it to the child thinking, yeah, I'm off for a few hours. Notably though, Alice says, it makes me feel uncomfortable rather than disapproving. So here these smartphone objects are simultaneously pacifier and toy, feeding aid and feeding obstacle, and transitional object and alien intruder. So to finish up then, the two examples I've talked about today touch upon the really complex intertwining, I think, of potential guilt and ambivalence, and also the need to compromise on supposed ideals of caregiving. And while that is all true in the mother-infant relationship in any case, it's here the technology that shapes and focuses this interplay. An attention to the multifaceted and fluid role played by objects as mediators of these experiences can help us think about the nuanced ways in which mothers of all kinds, including disabled mothers, experience day-to-day mothering, and the potential forms of loneliness or distance that entails, both psychical and sensory. So I will leave it there with thanks again to Jess and to Paulina for allowing me to talk about her work today. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks so much, Harriet, and for 3 brilliant papers, which I greatly enjoyed, indeed was thrilled by. I'm interested in this question. We've kind of ended on ambivalence. Helen ended her paper by saying, I don't have a conclusion. And I was thinking how Lisa ended her paper with Helen White-Reed's kind of house. And I wondered how the connections, I'm going to pose this question to the panelists, that you were kind of drawing between these papers. I'm interested in the ways in which kind of Lisa's paper brought to light this question of, essentially we've structured, when we think of welfare, we've structured a society around the child, but what would it mean to structure a society around a mother? And perhaps that is precisely the problem that we've kind of been left with when we look at Rachel White-Reed's house and what that symbolizes and how that's kind of only intensified since that kind of 1992 work of art. So I'm both going to invite you to to ask questions to one another, but also to think about, I suppose, kind of actual practical and kind of theoretical strategies for approaching this question of how to start from mothering. And I'm interested as in kind of Raka Ettinger's work, and obviously that's still quite kind of theoretical. So I wondered, what are the possibilities of kind of broaching this amazing kind of intervention in kind of a maternal psychoanalysis, and thinking about kind of wider social strategies. They are quite broad questions. I don't know if anyone is willing to start.
Thank you, Jess. I mean, that is actually very helpful to me, the way that you've drawn that together, because I suppose that is the key question that has preoccupied much feminist literature for a long time. What would it be like to centre social relations around questions of dependency and interdependency rather than individualism? What would it mean to centre the disabled mother as the mother? That is, as the mother who allows us to understand what mothering is about, which is a question of interdependency between mother and child, rather than this idea that dependency is something that we grow out of, and that therefore mothers, arrive at a place of being somehow independent rather than themselves dependent. And so for me, the figure of the mother with the prosthetic arm is an incredibly useful, helpful kind of figure. And I think Paulina's work also really draws attention to these very strange, ambivalent, in-between type objects that also help us to decenter the idea of the upright, going back to Caballero, sort of non-inclined, non-leaning over, non-dependent kind of subject. So I think that is kind of step one. The question is why it has been so difficult, so difficult to do that work socially and politically. At the moment, there's this sort of big discussion going on about care and what would it mean to sort of instigate caring economies, caring states, caring political strategies, and so on. And I think that one of the difficulties with that is that it doesn't quite attend to how very difficult it is to understand that care is related to dependency, and that is, the repudiation of a dependency, not as an infantile state, but as a lifelong state, I think is part of what we go on struggling with.
And of course, I suppose it's kind of bringing to light the question of who's been doing the care work for low pay during the pandemic, and the inability to raise the price of kind of care work, the increasing kind of invisibility of it. But also care workers themselves who often do double shifts, who are also kind of mothers and doing that kind of care work. Again, not just a comment rather than a question there.
I was just going to respond to the point or to the question about what would it look like to organise a society around mothering rather than around children. And it's sort of interesting to think about this historically, just how the interests of mothers and children were assumed to be one and the same in that's a sort of a fundamental assumption within British social policy paradigms throughout the 20th century and politics. It's also and also within feminism. So the power of this kind of maternalist strand within feminism in Britain has been profound, very, very important throughout the first half of the 20th century, and then sort of integrated in some ways in the welfare state. And I think we also see this in this kind of profound reluctance, and I was so struck by this when I was researching my book, to frame debates about childcare as debates about women's choices. I mean, that actually doesn't really happen until the 1970s. So sort of right up to that point, childcare is legitimate where it's in the interest of children. And the idea that actually it could be also about gender equality and about giving women choices, that's a feminist idea that appears in the 1970s. And even then, it doesn't really become part of the mainstream policy discourse around childcare really until the 1990s. And I would argue that even under New Labour, who sort of put huge amounts of money into Britain's childcare infrastructure, there was still a real ambivalence about talking about childcare as something that was as a feminist issue, something that was about women's choices and women's autonomy, rather than being about the stability of the family or dealing with childhood inequalities, which of course are important, social policy objectives as well. So I think that there's a whole, there is a kind of historical, historical sort of ideological superstructure that we can, that helps us to answer that question.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. And I would add to that, I think there's a sort of shared psychical superstructure as well around that, in which the kind of all kinds of ambivalence are placed in the container of motherhood. So it's not just about mother's ambivalence, but that a sort of widespread fear of the regression that could be seen at the heart of that kind of and I mean regression in a wholly positive sense. It's thinking about that kind of radical dependency that Lisa referred to, and interdependency, I think, is a sort of ever-present blind spot, if that makes any sense, in society. So I think you're right, those kind of superstructures and the way they've both been constructed, but the way they're perpetuated as well, feeds into these really what am I trying to say? These sort of day-to-day, very micro level experiences of mothers, and obviously of parents more generally. I mean, the intimate texture of it, and that's what obviously why I was wanting to come up with an example of something like the prosthesis, which is such a sort of localized case study, literally localized to the body, but I think it denotes that kind of wider tension. I would bring this up, seeing as several members of it are here, but I'm currently in a book group with Jess and a couple of other people here as well. We're reading Cooper and Lusada's Borderline Welfare, and I think they're very good at thinking about those superstructures as ways for us to hive off the real shared cultural ambivalence we have around those questions of care and dependency, and I'd really recommend that book.
I guess one way is to think of how kind of revolutionary kind of motherhood is in this way, that actually it kind of centering motherhood really kind of brings precisely how things aren't functioning to light, and it makes sense to kind of thinking back to the astonishing statistics, which I suppose I half knew, that Lisa started with about the burden that the psychical and social burden that mothers have kind of experienced during this pandemic, and the ability for that. I suppose that thinking about that, it's been such an interdisciplinary panel, and it's been brilliant in the way that it comes together. But actually thinking, it's interesting to return to these kind of these stats, and to think about this question of kind of welfare and schooling, and the possibilities of thinking about. I suppose it's also quite mothering under capitalism, and the kind of just the impossibility of that kind of position.
I wonder too, if it's all right to jump in, is thinking about the pandemic, the way that there have been a few, haven't there, sort of media articles around that we need to think differently about parenting in general. So I wonder if also to decenter the idealized mother, obviously, especially after these unignorable, you would hope, experiences that have come out during the pandemic about the sort of double load of women's work. I think as well as decentering the women in that sense of, when we talk about parenting, we're not just talking about mothering, and actually the other half, being fully a half, will release the mothering half. But as well as that, I think in terms of psychoanalytic theory and criticism, while I'm obviously totally behind the idea of, you know, feminist psychoanalysis, I feel like I wish that was just what we were calling psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory, and that to unpick, you know, the problematic structures on which the role of the mother was founded upon in early psychoanalytic theory, I just hope we're not equally hiving off kind of feminist psychoanalysis, when psychoanalysis should be and is, but should be an implicitly feminist psychoanalysis at this point.
Yeah, it's reminding me both of, I suppose, the comment that I mentioned earlier of Denise Riley's War in the Nursery and Hannah Gavran's paper that Helen pointed to, and this idea of this call for reintegration, and also of Lisa's paper that she published this summer on the maternal death drive, that I thought was such a kind of interesting topic, and I wondered if anyone wanted to respond to.
Quite like to hear what everyone who's here is thinking, actually. I know that there are people here who will have really interesting views on all of this.
I can say so. Thank you very much for inviting me to join. It was really interesting. One of the things I mentioned to Harriet earlier in the week is that the objects that I created, somehow they have gained a life of their own, and different audiences interpret them and see them through their own lens. So for designers, they're critical artifacts or conversational probes, and then for psychoanalytic audiences, they're maternal ambivalence objects, which is what Lisa called them when she first met them, and then I call them ambivalent objects. And when I showed them at the Freud Museum, people asked me whether there were objects for the good enough mother, or all kinds of names, and then different members of the public called them different things, and the participants in the project had different responses. But going back to the question about what it would be like in society if we centered more around mothers, as a designer, a lot of the work was about challenging how, with critical design, how in traditional design, we design for creating solutions. So if you think of the objects for mother and infant, very often are about being ergonomics, or being about around mobility, about safety, about monitoring the health of the baby, which kind of preserves sometimes the idea that parenthood is this state of constant worry and so on, and where instinctive knowledge maybe is not so reliable. And so critical design was very much about looking at users as not just subjects that have needs, ergonomic needs or physical needs, but actually that have an internal world. So critical design looks at objects as complicated people with even contradictory needs, or they are neurotic. So the role of these objects was also to expose mothers as complicated, and to challenge these visions that, you know, in traditional design, we show them as benevolent, passive, who are just existing for the benefit of the child, and everything that they buy is for in terms of safety. So in that sense, I think critical design, or these kind of objects, have a role in exposing users as more complicated than just people with kind of physical needs and so on. So I think that there's a role there as well. There's kind of this parallel there with psychoanalysis as well, in terms of the internal need and not just the physical need of the body and so on. I don't know if that made sense. I'm not a psychoanalyst. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Helen, actually, when you were talking about the, you know, popularization of psychoanalytic ideas through women themselves, but through broadcasting and so on. So obviously Winnicott's kind of radio broadcasts and so on. I actually, what is my question? I suppose I'm thinking, is that itself an early sign of, I just wonder if there was, you know, there was this kind of sort of post-war surge of interest in a lot of the questions we're talking about. Obviously they were framed in a very different way, but do you feel historically that it sort of abated and retreated? And if so, do you think there's a sort of particular reason for that? That's a horrible question, really.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, like Jess, Denise Riley's War in the Nursery is a sort of really kind of seminal text, and one that I read a really long time ago. I think I read it as an undergraduate, and just kind of opened up all sorts of new ways of thinking about the post-war period. And actually there's been, real interest in my field of modern British history in the 1940s to the 1970s as a period of where Britain is, broadly speaking, a social democracy, and how that produces new forms of knowledge about what it means to be a good citizen, what it means to be what stable families look like, and the idea of sort of emotional security and emotional citizenship becomes really important, and often that's centered on children. So, I mean, historians have been writing about the sort of popularization of Bowlby and the sort of notion of Bowlbyism for a really long time. I mean, when I was thinking about it in the context of my work on working motherhood, it's so difficult to kind of pin down or to speak with any precision about how far these ideas are really being internalized by mothers. So in the questionnaire data, so I've got about 1,000 replies from graduate mothers to that questionnaire. No one names Winnicott or Bowlby specifically. A few people do talk about, vaguely about, I've been reading in a book and it suggests that that when they're young, it's really important that I'm with them. But it doesn't come up that often. And actually a lot of the language around being psychologically tied to the home or feeling a kind of strong sense of responsibility is actually a much kind of older maternalist language that's been around for a really long time. The idea of sort of sacred motherhood, or motherhood as a kind of moral duty, or a sort of higher duty. So it's sort of difficult to kind of pinpoint it down. But I mean, there are historians who've done oral history, which again, do suggest that these ideas were really being internalized in quite important ways. And Viola Klein, who did the questionnaire, she says somewhere in some of her one of her papers, about how she thinks middle-class women are particularly susceptible to Bowlbyism because they're the ones who are reading books and they're not necessarily getting the kind of informal knowledge from their mothers or from their sisters or from people on the street, people in the neighborhood. And that would fit then with a kind of, the feminist backlash in the 70s. I think Faye Weldon said, Bowlby sort of taught a whole generation of middle-class women that they couldn't let go of their children's hands. So, yeah, but it's very difficult to pinpoint precisely, I think, that cultural resonance at a more popular level.
Great, thanks so much, Helen. I was thinking of Doris Lessing's story To Room 19 when you were talking about, Viola Klein. I don't know if you know it, but that's a kind of great contextualization of kind of middle-class motherhood, I think, that you've just kind of outlined. I wondered if anyone else in the audience has any questions. I know that there's a few people who work on motherhood, so it would be great if you felt comfortable to come in.
Or pop a question into chat. Or...
Yeah.
I do have a
So I'll ask a question.
So I'll just read it out, Andrea's. So this is from Andrea Brady. Have we moved into a cultural moment when ambivalence is the predominant quality performed by mothers? Speaking here from my experience in the playground rather than academic research, but it seems almost impossible to express pleasure in mothering, pride in the child. The conversation is always about fatigue, frustration, annoyance, the drains of mothering.
I think it's a very interesting cultural moment in terms of what it might mean to either talk about the desire for mothering, the pleasure in mothering, as you say, and whether ambivalence itself has become a sort of badge or a way to communicate that one has, on top of everything else, managed to absorb the kinds of literatures that would, in some ways, it's another version of what it means to be a good enough mother, is to know about ambivalence on top of everything else. So I would agree that I think that, that we have layer upon layer upon layer of the reabsorption of all sorts of versions of idealized mothers that I think for many of us, we've been writing for a long time about the ways that certain good enoughness slips into being ideal very easily. So I would say that the mother who's able to be ambivalent is part of that sort of formation. I think it's really complicated, the whole issue about why it's difficult to talk about motherhood as pleasurable, and whether that's seen, this whole issue about what it is that one is allowed to take back from the experience of having a child. And I suppose that's why I feel it's really important to theorize maternal subjectivity and maternal experience, and not just speak from the level of experience, but for something to mean something socially and culturally. In other words, for the pleasure of motherhood to have a social, cultural and political meaning, I think really matters. And it links actually with just your question really about, what does one do with Attinger? Well, I think all of this is about trying in a way to build a politics actually around mothering. And in order to do that, then mothering has to be a meaningful experience that does something in the social and political world. And so in some ways, I think theorizing maternal pleasure is a really important part of that.
Could I just add, I completely agree, add a sort of I was about to say post-it, don't mean that. What do I mean? An extra note to that, which is around, I think you're right, and I think if there is to be a kind of reconfigured politics of mothering, then also incredibly important is obviously to think of all the different ways there are to be mothers, not least people who might not identify as women being mothers, and what does that mean about what does parental ambivalence or maternal ambivalence mean in that situation? How can a politics embrace all of those different experiences without some of the kind of hierarchical idealizations that have obviously happened today? I think it's a huge task. I think grappling with the cultural structures for women who were have identified as women their whole lives is hard enough. So I think a politics would have to embrace all of those different experiences, and I'm not quite sure how to do that. My sense is that a focus on personal accounts fueling those superstructures has to be in there somewhere, but I guess I think that's where research can come in. But anyway, I'll stop there. I'm aware there's extra questions. But.
Can I just add one other thing which I think is really important to gesture towards is there was some really amazing data that came out recently that showed the birth rate has absolutely plummeted during the COVID pandemic, and of course this kind of fuels a kind of prior crisis for again kind of created by what was it, mothering under capitalism, or sort of asset economy, where there are people who feel that they cannot have children, that they cannot become mothers, and I think that's really important as well to think about when we're thinking through the politics of mothering, and also the kind of political economy of mothering, of becoming a mother, which I think carries such a high psychic charge. I mean, certainly, and I mean maybe more for within the middle classes. I mean, the middle classes, if however we define that. I think so many women and younger women in academia who I know, for whom this is an absolutely crucial issue. It's a sort of central issue for them. And it's so that's important to think about as well, I think.
Absolutely, kind of mothering in Rachel Whiteread's house, that kind of structure. And I just kind of wanted to add in there that I think Sophie Lewis's work on mothering and gestation is really useful, coming back to Harriet's point about kind of expanding the language of motherhood. But I wanted Amber Hamill has a question that I'd love to hear a little more about, idea taboo almost of making space for entertainment and leisure in motherhood, in particular by use of or as enabled by technology, and how this might relate to loneliness. So motherhood, kind of entertainment and pleasure.
I mean, if it's all right to jump in again, sorry, I feel like I've been talking quite a lot, but again, I think Paulina's work is absolutely brilliant in this respect, because it, especially the kind of the narrative accompaniments to her critical design work, so that the workshop texts from young, well, mothers of young children, also mothers of slightly older children. But I think, you know, my sense, and again, I think a lot of Paulina's work is obviously opening up people's responses, but I guess, so my personal sense is it can be a celebration of how, you know, why not use technology as occasionally a well, I was about to say a crutch actually, but you know, an assistant. I think, you know, there's so much well, ambivalence around the role of objects as well, you know, as well as the way that mothers or parents use them. Paulina, yeah.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think that my work was not just about maternal ambivalence, it was also about the ambivalence towards technology, especially in family life, because we have this love and hate relationship. We need it, but we hate it. We hate it that we use it so much, but we really need it. I think there's a lot going on with technology, of how it kind of, like I said before, it kind of gives the idea with monitoring the health of the baby, gives the idea that parenting is full of worry, but at the same time we rely on it so much. And it's equally with entertainment, you know, we have a lot of ambivalence towards technology, and I think that's why it's so complicated, the presence of the smartphone, because it's like a double ambivalence going on in there. It's yeah.
I know that there are children knocking the door, so I'm officially going to thank all of our panelists for some excellent papers, and I'm going to invite you I will leave invite you to the kind of motherhood and loneliness after party if you want to stay on and ask some questions, but we will stop the recording now, and if you would all unmute yourself and give our wonderful speakers a round of applause for giving us this wonderful holding place for an hour and a half. I'm deeply grateful. So.
A lovely comment from Harriet Cooper before she's gone.